Irish President Michael D. Higgins says the government is playing with fire for opening a debate on military neutrality. Now that follows discussions over whether Ireland should become a NATO member. So would that be a good move? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. It's great to have your company. Now, the Ukraine war has opened up some big questions over whether Ireland should join NATO. The problem with joining the alliance is that it would effectively put an end to Ireland's neutrality, which for decades has been the absolute cornerstone of Irish foreign policy.
Ireland's policy of neutrality is a legacy of its history. The island declared itself a neutral state after gaining independence from the British in 1922. The aim was to steer clear of involvement in military alliances and conflicts. But discussions over whether Ireland should join NATO has put the whole theory under tension. Irish President Michael Higgins says the Irish government risks burying Ireland in other countries' agendas by drifting towards NATO. Higgins has since apologised for the comment, and several politicians have said his comments were unfair. Other European countries have also had to grapple with the same question over NATO recently. Finland joined and Sweden is joining soon. Countries like Austria and Switzerland are clinging to their neutral status despite the war in Ukraine. Will Ireland do the same?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Dublin, we have Gerard Howlin, who's a former advisor to the Irish government, and Dan O'Brien, chief economist at the Institute of International and European Affairs. And in Bath is Patrick Berry, a senior lecturer in security, specialising in warfare and counter-terrorism, and he is also a NATO analyst. Gents, great to see you all. I want to start with that quote, very memorable as it was, that President Higgins gave in an interview. He later apologised for it, saying that it was playing with fire as Ireland started drifting towards NATO. Come to you first, Gerard Howlin. You're a former government advisor. Was he right to say what he said, or did he have a point?
So my understanding is he did not apologise for that remark. He apologised for a different remark given in the context of the same interview. And he stood fairly firmly over the substance of his remarks, including the one you just quoted. In relation to whether he was right and wrong, I mean, Irish defence is a box of wet matches. It's not going to explode or go anywhere soon, regrettably, because such is the level of our underinvestment for so long. And of course, what was wrong with all of that, in my opinion, was the president's inappropriate use of his powers and his office to meddle in something that is purely political and which, as head of state and arbiter of our constitution, he had no role in whatsoever, in a way that was very unhelpful.
Dan, what was your take on what President Higgins said?
Well, let me just say, Enda, that if your viewers want to look at a map of the North Atlantic, every single one of Ireland's neighbours in the North Atlantic, from Iceland up north to Portugal in the south, go over to Canada, all down the seaboard of the Atlantic in Europe, every single one of those countries is in NATO. In my view, in this current climate in Europe and the world, it is reckless for Ireland not to be in a serious defence alliance like NATO.
And bring in Patrick. Patrick, you obviously read the interview President Higgins gave. What was your take on those quotes and the subsequent furore as it played out in Ireland?
Yeah, slightly different from the other guests. I don't mind really. I know it's not actually his role, but I don't mind on issues of national strategic importance the president stating a view, but I don't think it was done in a balanced way.
Gerard, if I just come back to you, I mean, why is neutrality such a cornerstone of Irish foreign policy, Irish life?
Well, it's arguably not a cornerstone, but it has a great romantic resonance, has a great political resonance, and that dates from the story of how we gained independence, our disalignment from the British Empire, the role we had as an exemplar for other countries decolonizing, and particularly our role during the Second World War, where we were militarily neutral, but not necessarily neutral in terms of our continued close association both with Britain and America. So neutrality is a word that's used, abused, misunderstood. It has meanings far beyond its actual content, but it is one that is deeply evocative in Irish politics and which politicians are extremely wary of for that reason.
Dan, it's quite a popular policy, though, isn't it? I saw a recent Irish Times poll suggesting 61% of the Irish public support neutrality.
Yeah, I think certainly all of the opinion polls suggest that, but I think we really have very rarely had any sort of deep discussion about security and defence policy in Ireland. We've always just assumed, because we're far out in the Atlantic and we have Britain on one side and the United States on the other side of the Atlantic, that we don't need to involve ourselves in these things and we're safe and we're not at risk. I think in a changing world, as the sort of threats that are emerging now, such as cyber threats, our National Health Service suffered a very significant cyber attack a couple of years ago. That if we had a greater debate about it, that maybe this support for neutrality might be a mile wide and an inch deep.
Patrick, what's your take on where Irish public opinion is at on this?
I think it's interesting to see how it's developed. There has been actually a bit of a debate recently, especially around the consultative forum that was hosted by the government in the last month or so. And at that, of course, you had some members of the public protesting outside, thinking it was going to be a drift towards NATO. And actually, it wasn't. I think there were fairly few people there that want to see Ireland in NATO. Actually, I think there's still broad support for neutrality generally. I think, as Jared said, it's pretty much understood. It's also a little bit of, there's an element of a myth there that we sort of pat ourselves on the back and go, aren't we great? We just do peacekeeping, which I think comes down to how actually history is taught in school, and it needs to bring out the nuance of our tradition of neutrality a lot more. So for me, I think, there is probably more support for neutrality. I don't have a problem with that. I'd like to see the Defence Forces funded to maintain our ability to stop belligerence if we are actually going to be a neutral nation.
Gerard, can I just ask you, neutrality, is Ireland really neutral, though? Because we have American aircraft are allowed to refuel at Shannon Airport. So it's a kind of pick and mix neutrality, isn't it?
It is a pick and mix neutrality. That doesn't make the word neutral less important. You could argue it's self-serving, but what it is very clearly a neutrality that is completely committed to the West, to the Western democracy, to Western values, and there's no ambiguity at all about that. And I think that the recent issue of Ukraine has exemplified that. Ireland is on side. Ireland contributes, not militarily, but there's no doubt whatsoever where the people or the government are. We are on side with Ukraine and its people. And we're on side for all of those Western values all of the time. Our economy is absolutely hardwired both to the European Union and to the United States. Our bread and butter and our ideas are Western in orientation and in self-interest.
I want to read to you all a quote from Leo Varadkar, who's the Taoiseach. He is the Irish Prime Minister. So in June, he said, as a small country of only 5 million people with a lot of airspace and a lot of seas, we can't think of defence security as something we can do alone. So we need to cooperate with our allies. But we do need to make sure that we're prepared and equipped to meet threats and challenges of today, including hybrid cyber terrorism in the economy. You touched upon the ransomware attack on the health service and its IT system in 2021. We know that some of the most important fibre optic cables in the Atlantic are off Ireland's coast. And we have a large number of American tech and pharma companies with European headquarters based in Ireland. Doesn't all of this, Dan, put Ireland at risk of attack from a hostile state, say like Russia?
I think it's certainly a risk. And one of the things that differs today compared to the past, when Ireland, neutrality, arguably the most important decision we made in terms of neutrality was when NATO was being established in the late 1940s. Ireland decided to stay out. Over that period, over the Cold War period between the late 1940s and the late 1980s, Ireland was a very small economy, and it was also one of the worst performing economies in Northwest Europe, if not the worst performing. So it really was an economic backwater. As you mentioned there now, it's become a hub in the transatlantic economy. Just one statistic, Ireland exports more computer services than any other country in the world, and that includes the United States and India, the two other biggest exporters, and those services go through cables. So a disruption to those cables would have a significant effect for the entire global tech industry. Just one example. So there really is a very different situation today in terms of Ireland being a target than in the past during the Cold War in the 1940s to 1980s. We're in a very, very different situation as a target today.
Patrick, just give us your view of the risks. I mean, if you look at Ireland and you're a wealthy state with the resources of a country like Russia, surely you're looking at Ireland and thinking this is the Achilles heel of Europe.
Well, they have been, and if you look at the very interesting application to expand their embassy in Dublin, which looked like basically an increase in listening posts and intelligence processing underground, and it was turned down, thankfully. But that shows you just what a juicy target Ireland is at the moment. And you know, a lot of it is to do with joined up thinking, joined up functionality in government. We're basically behind the curve in terms of how we organise and how we co-locate and integrate the different arms of government in terms of defence. It's basically, you know, a kind of 1960s approach still. We don't even have a dedicated defence minister, a functioning National Security Council, an inspectorate of the defence forces, and I could go on, oversight committees in the Dáil or the Parliament. So, you know, we really need to get with the programme essentially and follow best practice in Europe, whether that's in neutral nations or NATO members. It doesn't really matter. It's just what you do, and you do. It's good housekeeping.
Gerard, you advised the Irish government year after year. You were in those rooms. You know all of the leaders in Irish politics. You know, the whole issue of defence and security, Ireland tags on defence minister with the role of foreign minister. What does that tell you about how seriously the Irish government takes this?
Well, it just confirms the fact that the Department of Defence and the Minister of Defence is a political and administrative backwater. And that's been a fact for a very long time. I mean, the story of the 20th century of Irish defence was brilliantly successful because we were far away from anyone who was remotely interested in us. So it was fine. But in the 21st century, there's a new phenomenon. Dan has outlined it. Apparently, 65% of cables crossing the Atlantic do so under Irish waters. 90% of aircraft crossing the North Atlantic do so within the ambit of Shannon Airport and the west of Ireland's air traffic control. And interference with us is a way of pulling the American tail or the European tail without getting too close to their claw. And our context has completely changed very quickly. But what hasn't changed at all is underspending, under emphasis, under importance in terms of our defence. We have a defence capability that is hardly capable of mustering a guard of honour, but it does have historically some strengths, including peacekeeping under the United Nations, which we are justifiably very proud, and we have niche capacity, particularly in relation to the area of bomb disposal, to name one area. But overall, we are at the moment 7,500 strong. That's the entire defence establishment. It should be 9,500, but in fact, notwithstanding that commitment, it's actually diminishing. And we have a further commitment that by 2028 we will be 11,500 strong, and that is not on track.
Dan, what was your reading of that application by the Russians to effectively turbocharge their embassy in Dublin? I mean, they had great plans, and this was happening on, you know, London's doorstep, and it barely made a ripple in the rest of Europe. But the Russians had very significant plans to really turbocharge that embassy, hadn't they?
They did indeed. I'm certainly no intelligence expert, but you know what I would say is clearly coming back to this point about Ireland becoming a hub in the transatlantic economy. We don't have very deep relations with economic relations with Russia. There was no certain economic or even political justification for such an expansion of the embassy. Therefore, it's very difficult not to arrive at the conclusion that it was for the reasons that one of the other panelists has already outlined, and that would not, in my view, have been a very good idea in terms of the security of the Irish state and its economy.
Patrick, just spell out for us how little investment Ireland has been making in recent years in terms of defence. I mean, is it the case that the Irish government is just saving money and claiming the moral high ground? You know, call it cakeism if you want, just wanting everything and not really paying very much for it.
Well, I'll give you a story, and because I tried to join the Irish Army in 2003 as an officer, and at the time it was a well-paid, highly desirable career, very, very selective to try to get in as an officer. And if you fast forward 20 years, the change is massive. They've had to double the size, actually more, to 2.5 times the size of the cadet class. That's affected the quality. It's also affected some discipline and other issues as well. So what they've basically done in that interim, and the 2008 financial crash is crucial in all this, is there was a government freeze on basically paying the whole sector. And once the Irish economy started to emerge in 2013 from that, the worst of it, gradually other sectors other parts of government started to catch up. But the defence forces have just been underinvested and no increase in pay since about 2008. Now, they have just started to address that, I should add, right? So they're just starting to get onto it. But the problem is then you have this massive retention problem. So people have just been leaving. They've been hemorrhaging qualified staff, especially, for example, the Navy, where all the crew have started to leave. Now they don't have enough crew to man the boats that they have, and they also need more boats. So that's just one issue, you know. There's been these problems. It's basically a chronic lack of funding for about 15 years is the thing. And now they've pledged to spend about $1.5 billion by 2028, and it is an increase in funding. They're doubling the defence budget really by that time they've pledged to. The problem is, of course, it's not enough, you know. And the commission, we had the Commission on the Defence Forces about 1.5 years ago report back, and it came up with a couple of paths forward. Well, actually 3 paths forward. One was do nothing and just let it stay the same, so let's ignore that one. Level of ambition 2 was to basically increase defence spending and gain more capacity capability in certain areas such as airlift, marine and air radar, so we can actually monitor our skies, not that we can do something about the sky threats at the moment anyway. And the final one was to level of ambition 3, which is where I'd be pushing, whether we're neutral or not, is to triple defence spending about over time, and get some proper assets, properly funded defence force, and including air interceptors which can actually police our skies. And we can therefore meet the demands set down by international law of what a neutral nation must be able to do, which is defend its airspace and sea space from belligerents.
Gerard, is it the case that the Irish government has made a very shrewd calculation here that if anything did happen, we would reach out to the European Union, the United States, even Britain to ride to our rescue? Is that a fair assessment?
No, and nobody was coming towards us or at us for a very long time. And now what comes towards us or at us will not be men landing on the beaches. It will be subterfuge. And that's a much more difficult thing to deal with. It'll be subterfuge, I should say, around our cables under seas, around our energy interconnectors, around our computer systems. We had a devastating intervention in our health system that destabilized it for days, and you can imagine people in bad health situations. This is really life-threatening and very serious. And in relation to Patrick's correct analysis, a big part of our recruitment problem in the defence forces is retention. You come in an economy. We have 3.8% unemployed. That's full employment. Other sectors are booming. You get good skills, and as soon as you have those skills, you leave for somewhere else that'll pay you much better. So there is a plan in hand. There will be more money between now and 2028, but it is a running to stand still from way behind to where we need to be to provide for even the most basic levels of self-defence as it is in actuality in a digitalized world in the 2020s.
Dan, do you think it's a case that defence talk in Ireland is not a vote winner and the politicians know it? People talk about housing, people talk about health, cost of living. Defence and Irish electorate switch off. Do you think the politicians have made that calculation?
I think they have, to a certain extent. There has been, as I mentioned earlier, a sort of sense that we are isolated, we're away from these from danger zones, and to some extent that is true. But political leadership involves raising issues which are important, and it's the first duty of a state to protect its citizens. Irish government, the quality of Irish government is broadly being quite good by international standards, but I think we do fall down in one area. There's a kind of inertia and a risk blindness in Irish political culture that we sort of say we won't, we just won't deal with things unless we need to deal with them. So politicians don't proactively look at problems that are coming down the line, and that can be very serious. We saw that as previously mentioned, we had a very severe banking crisis here in 2008. Risks were clearly there, they were ignored. So we all hope that it will never come to a point where we regret not paying more attention to security risks.
Patrick, you're an ex-soldier yourself. Is it true, what I've been hearing, that more and more Irish soldiers are choosing to serve in other people's armies?
Well, they always have, to be honest with you, but it's just about the scale. The time when I chose, I ended up serving in the British Army because it was so hard to get into the Irish Army, essentially, and I would have had to wait another year. And we had lots of soldiers. I served in the Royal Irish Regiment of the British Army, and we had lots of soldiers from North and South who, and obviously, especially from the South in this case, who would maybe fail the eye colour blindness test. And ended up, funny enough, as snipers in the British Army, which therefore, obviously require really high level of good eyesight. So it goes to show you that, but this is a long-term thing. I think the numbers have generally been ticking over. For example, in the British Army, it went up until about Brexit, and then I think it started to drop off a little bit of people joining from the south, and then it's picked up again in the last year or two. But it does fluctuate. It fluctuates. There's a whole load of things that influence from the work, from basically the recruitment drive in the Irish Army and the spaces available, all the way to the employment offers in the Republic as well. So it changes.
Well, this whole discussion has been sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's take a listen to President Volodymyr Zelensky. He said,
"Although Ireland is a neutral country, this neutrality does not mean indifference, and this is very important. Thank you for all your support."
So that was what Zelensky said to the Irish Taoiseach Prime Minister just a few weeks ago. Sweden, Finland, Austria, they're all neutral, but they've all had major rethinks, Gerard, because of Russia. Should Ireland be looking to join NATO?
Ireland's not going to join NATO anytime soon. It's completely unrealistic politics. Our level of defence spending is nowhere near anything approaching what it would be required. And I think a debate around NATO, it's a four-letter word. It's not going to pass. It's not realistic politics. It's not going to happen.
Dan, should Ireland join NATO?
As I say, I think Ireland should have joined NATO in 1949 when it was established, just like most of its neighbours.
Patrick?
Don't think it's going to happen. Agree with Gerard, and I'd much rather see investment in the defence forces and also the reform of government to be better prepared for hybrid threats.
Can I ask as well, looking ahead to the next election in Ireland, likely to come in 2024, Sinn Fein have been riding high in the polls under Mary Lou MacDonald. Sinn Fein, we know, are staunchly neutral. They are anti-NATO. If they were to get into government in Ireland, Gerard, what would that mean for Ireland's defence policy?
Well, I don't think it'll make a great deal of difference, frankly. I think, you remember, Sinn Féin has a particular military history of its own. In relation to NATO, it is opposed, but as I say, I think it's a completely unrealistic policy, regardless of who is in government. And of course, in government, Sinn Féin will be faced and will have to undertake our commitments in the EU, in the Partnership for Peace, and with the defence forces that is not fit for purpose, on which there is a plan in hand and budgetary commitments in the years going forward. So the net issue for Sinn Féin is, if it comes into government in 24-25, is it going to spend that money that is allocated in 25, 26 and 27? And there's no sign that they won't.
Dan, what's your take on a Sinn Féin government possibly as early as next year? What would that mean for Irish defence?
I think largely for foreign policy, there would probably be a little change. One area that has raised itself recently, a former defence minister here said that Ireland has a secret air defence treaty with the United Kingdom. Now, Sinn Féin is typically objects to the British military because of its role in Northern Ireland in the past. So it would be interesting to see if that became a political issue if Sinn Fein were leading the government here.
Patrick, can I just ask you that question? You're a former serving soldier as well. What do you think would happen if Sinn Fein get into power in Ireland next year? Will they take much of an interest in defence, NATO, and this whole issue?
Well, they've actually, if you look at their sound bites on this, they remain staunchly no to NATO. I think they understand that's where the sort of their electorate are and some of the wider public. So I'd expect that. They're also committed to funding the defence forces, they've said, and potentially an increase to that. So like Jared said, I'd say that they'll continue to honour what the government has already put forward. I would potentially see if there's going to be any sort of review or increase of that. I think really that interesting thing about Sinn Fein getting into government in Ireland is what happens to the intelligence and the Garda and organised crime, etc. Given that the proven links, between organised crime and previous members of Sinn Fein, etc. Some of whom are in jail at the moment. So, that's the really interesting thing, and I know that's something that would be on the minds of people serving inside Irish intelligence and criminal investigations, of course.
The clock has caught up with us. What a fascinating discussion. Jared Howland and Dan O'Brien in Dublin, Patrick Berry in Bath. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and DeBrady and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.